Hello and welcome to this lecture on food and nutrition. The following presentation provides some of the foundational information and case studies on food and nutrition in disasters and conflicts. These are largely based on our field experiences and learning. And as always with any of our lectures or presentations, please do send us your questions and challenges or contribute as well with your own thoughts. When it comes to food and nutrition, regardless of whether it's in a disaster or conflict or not, we know that any healthy adult requires around 2,000 kilocalories per day. And obviously that varies depending on the age and the height and the weight and a various range of other factors for each individual. As well as that, nutrition has been called the single greatest environmental influence on babies in the womb and during infancy, and it remains essential throughout the first years of life. In the first 5 years of a child's life, the brain develops more and faster than it does at any other time, and the effects of pure nutrition early in life can lead to a variety of challenges and issues such as delayed motor and cognitive development, potential social and emotional problems, and also attention difficulties. So nutrition for children in infants in a disaster or conflict is of particular importance. Similar to the other sectors, when we look at their delivery in disasters and conflicts, they're all interrelated. They all have an impact on each other. And again, the context is absolutely crucial. If a disaster such as a flood or a volcanic eruption occurs, then there's the great possibility that food stores themselves may have been completely wiped out or even contaminated. And so usually immediate food aid is needed. As well, the environment dictates how and what food aid can be delivered. Is it reachable and accessible by road or by ship, or airdrops needed? You also need to consider the season, and if a harsh winter is coming or a rainy season that could impede your future aid deliveries, then you need to think about how to create local stores or communal stores so that people have sufficient access to food throughout different seasons. And then again, look at the population themselves. Who are the affected population that will be receiving the food aid? What are their traditional types of food? Do they have the means to cook the food and to store it? Do they have access to the fuel for cooking? Is the situation secure or insecure? And also, we mentioned earlier, just thinking back to the affected population, the specialist nutritional requirements of children, but you, when looking at your affected population, also think through the additional nutritional requirements of other particular groups, such as those with HIV/AIDS, pregnant and lactating mothers, and there's a range of other people. So really understanding your population and who you are targeting is essential to knowing the type of nutrition you're going to provide. Food aid can be extremely political. Is the food aid itself being provided to combatants in conflict? Is it being fairly distributed? Are people selling it? In Syria, we work with an INGO, and they had a warehouse full of wheat that was to be distributed. Now, ISIS managed to steal all of that, and the INGO in question then spent the next 6 months writing reports to the various donors and going for a series of interviews to explain how they were not supporting terrorist activities. Because now when you receive funding, and particularly since 9/11, there will usually be something in the contract about a fiduciary duty. That's a legal term that states you will act solely in another party's interests. And it's one of the humanitarian responsibilities that humanitarian actors now carry. So all of these other issues have to be thought through in terms of how you will protect the food aid that you're delivering and how you ensure that it gets to the people you intend it to be delivered to. And also you don't want to flood any market so that any future harvest or food sales from the local population are impacted on. During the first days after a disaster, the extent of damage is often unknown and communications are difficult. And as an immediate relief step, available food should be distributed in sufficient quantity, really, to ensure survival. No detailed calculations need be made of the precise vitamin, mineral, or protein content in the food distributed in the initial phase, but supplies should be acceptable, palatable, and at least provide sufficient energy. During this stage of the emergency, it's simply important to provide a minimum of around 6 to 8 megajoules per person per day. But as soon as possible after the disaster or emergency situation has occurred, an initial assessment and analysis is needed to determine people's own food and income sources and identify any threats to these sources. If food aid is needed across the population, a general ration and distribution system can be established. Enhancing the general food ration by targeted supplementary feeding is usually the primary strategy for correction of moderate malnutrition and a strategy to prevent severe malnutrition as well. When rates of malnutrition are high, targeting the moderately malnourished can be insufficient, and so all individuals meeting certain at-risk criteria, such as pregnant women or children and infants, can be targeted, which is a blanket supplementary feeding. And then obviously when it gets to severe malnutrition, we have therapeutic care, which is really inpatient 24-hour care. If you want to know the specific technical details of the minimum food standards and nutritional standards to be delivered in a crisis, then refer to the SPHERE handbook, which covers food security and nutritional assessment, infant and young child feeding, management of acute malnutrition, and also micronutrient deficiencies in food security. But remember, as always, when using the SPHERE handbook, it's there as a guide, often there as an ideal, and you always have to take what it states and then contextualize it to the specific affected population that you are working with. Now, I wanted to talk to you because, again, if you want to look at all of the specific technical details, there's lots written and available published materials out there, and I can supply you with lots of those. But I wanted to raise plum peanut with you all. I first came across plum peanut in South Sudan in 2005. And this is how it was being delivered and distributed by boats during the rainy season to a range of villages. Now, in 1999, André Briand, the French scientist, he was sitting at his breakfast table watching his children eat peanut butter on bread and realised the calorific value of it. So then he went on to develop plum peanut, a peanut-based food for use in famine relief. It's ready-to-use therapeutic food in a foil pouch, which contains 500 kilocalories per pouch, and it weighs only 92 grams. Plum peanut was first used on a large scale during 2005 for the crisis in Darfur, initially feeding around 30,000 children. It's since been used in many humanitarian responses, including Ethiopia, Congo, Malawi, and Niger. Plum peanut can be administered to meet varying levels of need. For example, 4 sachets of plum peanut per person per day would be used for severe malnutrition, and 1 sachet per person per day with supplementary foods to treat moderate malnutrition. There are a few characteristics that plum peanut has that make it extra great. For example, once opened, plum peanut has a shelf life of 2 years, which is advantageous in locations where refrigeration or storage is a problem. Plum peanut also allows parents to care for their own children at home as opposed to in a crowded hospital or feeding centre. This both frees up much needed hospital space and returns responsibility and control to the parents. Another major advantage of plum peanut is that unlike the powdered milk that we used to use and give to malnourished children before, no water or any preparation is necessary, which is important in areas where water supplies may have been disrupted or that water is scarce or contaminated or unsafe. And because the use of powdered milk with unsafe water sources used to cause further illness and problems in children, and because plum peanut doesn't need this, it makes it an extra great product for infants and children. There are now also 19 UNICEF-approved producers of plum peanut across the world, including in countries like Sudan and Haiti and Ethiopia and Niger. So it's developing local supply chains and producers. as well. Now, I could have selected a number of countries for case studies, but I wanted to highlight one, in particular Afghanistan, where there was conditionalities placed on food aid, particularly looking at the late 90s and early 2000s. The Taliban's restrictions on women covering work and education, movement and dress had sparked intense debate on gender issues in Afghanistan. Sadly, this debate has done nothing to enhance the basic rights of Afghan women and children and families in many parts. Given the lack of other policy instruments, humanitarian assistance became the primary tool with which to fight gender discrimination. As a result of lobbying by a number of interest groups, immense pressure was brought to bear on donors and aid agencies to restrict their assistance until progress was made. And that meant actually a number of ill-informed conditionalities. WFP, the largest provider of food aid, made its assistance beyond life-saving spheres conditional upon the Taliban changing its position and responding favourably to UN appeals on basic rights for women. As far as I'm aware, that's had little to no effect in Kabul and most other areas. And the losers, of course, have been Afghan women and their families. Oxfam's suspension of the Logar water supply project in protest of the Taliban's restriction on Afghan female and aid workers in the late 90s also did nothing really to help Afghan women and their families get access to clean water. Similarly, UNICEF's conditional support has failed to promote the right of Afghan children to education, and the aid agencies have in fact extended to boys the Taliban's ban on female education by withdrawing their support from education, where boys alone are allowed to go to school. Most of these photographs on this slide are mine from Kabul about September, October 2015, except the top left one, which was from an organisation that I'm working with from the Badakhshan province, rural Afghanistan. We've been working with the Aga Khan Foundation in Afghanistan. They work in some of the remotest areas and many Taliban areas. As I mentioned, they work in Badakhshan. And Aga Khan have created schools in Badakhshan, and all of these are attended by both boys and girls. They've managed to achieve this for a number of reasons. They employ local staff in senior positions and invest a lot in their local staff. They remain in locations long term and have been working in the region since the early 90s. They didn't stop working or stop any projects during Taliban rule or during any conflict periods. All of the schools established came as a request from the local communities. And as well as that, they've also undertaken electrification projects in many areas, which resulted in many people getting TVs, which then gave them access to the outside world. And as a result, many of the families now watch Indian TV and Hindi movies and are seeing how girls and women can have a different role. I've got many different case studies with extensive data collected from this province on this. In one of the areas, the Taliban refused to allow girls to attend a school, and the Aga Khan staff met with the Taliban and the community, and they said they would only build a school if it was for both boys and girls. So it was up to the community and the Taliban to decide whether the school should be built in the project, whether the project should proceed. The Taliban and the community later came back and said it had agreed that girls could attend, and since then the school has been built and girls are attending. This is slightly away from the issue of food, but it's just to show you how different conditionalities of aid have not worked in the past. And yet without conditionalities of aid, you can still actually try and achieve a certain number of steps forward in different ways. Donors such as the UK and the US have ruled that all forms of capacity building of state welfare institutions should be avoided because this transfers resources on to an illegitimate regime. And moreover, they've also drawn a distinction between life-saving activities and life-sustaining ones. Yet in Afghanistan, as in a number of other countries, the conflict has endured for so long and the human, physical and institutional infrastructure has become so degraded that this distinction is not meaningful in terms of aid programming. In short-term, localised, project-specific and relief-focused interventions will not meet humanitarian aids. What is needed is an acceptance from donors that it is possible to negotiate for principal goals with those who have different principles, and that it is possible to work with the state structures in Taliban-controlled areas in a principled way. Moving on, this is our final slide. When it comes to food delivery and food aid, you have to, from the beginning, think about your exit strategy. If it is a one-off short-term disaster, this can be simpler because it can be about re-establishing markets and livelihoods. If you're in a protracted ongoing crisis, it's a lot more complex, as you should be looking at how you create sustainable livelihoods, but also livelihood strategies that are adaptable and resilient. And this can include backup mechanisms and diverse livelihoods so that if one is destroyed or impacted by conflict or further crises, you are still able to access or purchase adequate food and nutrition. Many of you may already be familiar with the Differed Livelihoods framework, but it is useful to think through it in terms of planning when responding to disasters and crises, even though it seems more as a developmental tool, because ultimately without livelihoods and some sort of sustainability there will be a constant chronic crises. I'm not going to spend too much time explaining the framework, rather I will let you all look over it, and if you have any questions then please send those to me. It's about understanding the transforming processes and structures and what makes these vulnerable. Then in the centre you have what we call the 5 assets pentagon, which makes you think through the human, natural, social, physical and financial capital that people have access to and how these are influenced. And then when you have an understanding of all of these, how you develop livelihood strategies. In many rural areas, the natural end to food aid is supposed to be where the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization steps in with seeds and tools for a return to agriculture. However, in many countries like Sudan and Somalia, this has not been effective, as without an end to the conflict and underlying poverty means that people remain extremely vulnerable with little resilience or alternative strategies to withstand even small shocks or crises such as one failed harvest or a late rainy season. And so therefore, I would say to anybody planning a humanitarian response in any of the sectors, you do need to have your exit strategy in mind, and you do need to be looking at for those people what will be their livelihood strategies. That brings us to the end of this presentation. I know I'd really welcome your thoughts and your views on the different topics and issues I've covered, and particularly if there's any areas that you would like me to cover in more detail or you'd like some further case studies, then please let me know and I'll be able to and happy to provide these.